Hello, Larry DuBois here, and thank you for joining us. We're in another series called Leadership Series. This is episode number 3, and I've entitled it Assuming the Role for Others. And it's going to include a couple of things. If you read in the description, basically, there are times when you will be called upon as a leader of a small group or a large group, either one, where you may assume the role of another. You may be able to sacrifice something, sacrifice perhaps even your life, as crazy as that sounds. Also, you have to take the blame for others sometimes. You have to take the brunt of the criticism, whatever it might be. There are times when you might provide your resources. So we're going to take a look at some of these things through the scriptures. And I've got, I think, 4 examples using Jesus and the apostles. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list. So I've encouraged you as the audience that you would go ahead and email me if you see something in the scriptures that I really miss, something that would really stand out in this category. So let's go ahead and get started. I've already prayed. Today is January 27th in the year of our Lord 2022, and I'm right here in Midtown Sacramento. So let's put our little there's our little logo up there from Midtown Sacramento. And I usually start off with that. But let's dig into our notes and our text. I got several scriptures for today's lesson. And so let's go ahead and get started. And so the first example I want to give is found in, it's actually in all 4 Gospels, the prayer in the garden. Now, I'm going to take and look at Mark 14. And in Mark 14, it might only be in 3. It might be in the Synoptics. I'm not sure on that one, so don't hold me to that. But it's definitely in. Usually, it's in all. For these when we're getting close to the crucifixion, but it's at least in the 3s, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I want to take a look at Mark's version here, and the whole context is where right before Jesus is arrested, and after they meet in the upper room, they're on their way to the Garden of Gethsemane there, and there is a time where Jesus takes James, John, and Peter. He goes off from the other disciples and goes off to prayer. And then he goes even further than those guys and he prays. And this is where he goes into that intense prayer that if, Lord, Father, God, if you can take this cup from me, but nevertheless, not my will, let your will be done. And this is where he was going in some extreme agony. But the disciples were there to be with them. And as you remember, we'll read verses 37 and 38. What had happened was when the Lord had taken these guys that he'd take a lot of times, the inner 3, if you will, Peter, James, and John, along with him on some of these excursions, like if he was going to raise somebody from the dead or he took them up on the Mount of Transfiguration, he had spent some close time with these 3 in particular, and this was the time when he did that. And it says in verse 37 there, it says, "Then he came and found them sleeping and said to Peter, 'Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak.'" Okay, well, back in verse 33, which I don't have that text on my notes there, but in the Word, if you want to follow along, by all means do that. In Mark 14 there, verse 33, it tells us that Jesus took James and John, and I already mentioned that, as well as Peter. And it's interesting, Peter didn't say, and you would have thought he could have said this the way he used to say some crazy things. He could have said, "Hey, Lord, why are you picking on me? Those guys didn't stay awake either. What are you going to do about them? Are you going to chew them out?" type thing. And he didn't do that. Maybe he was starting to learn his lessons. But when this happens to you, as you're an up and coming leader yourself, usually you have the Lord. Obviously, He's the head. He's the head of the church. But you may be on your way up in a church staff or some situation where you have somebody that's over you, another overseer. But it's going to seem like you're singled out. When all three of them actually fell asleep, the Lord comes to Peter and he confronts him. Peter, why couldn't you stay? He's kind of holding the group because Peter was ahead of the group in many ways. And he was holding Peter accountable for the whole group. And there'll be maybe a time in leadership where you're going to be held accountable for the whole group. And I would just encourage you not to feel singled out or feel like you're being picked on, but this is actually, it's not a negative thing I wrote here in my bullet points, but it's because you show responsibility. You show leadership. You show one that are going to be in charge of other people, and that's why you're being singled out, so that you would learn the important lessons, that you would get it. Now, one of the things that happened to me years ago in the secular workplace, I worked for Safeway as a grocery clerk. Now, this isn't exactly related, but I felt chided because it was hard for me to get a day off. A lot of times I wanted a certain day off, and it was at the time I was working in the produce department. And I wasn't the greatest produce worker by any means, but I was a good worker. I was dependable. And I wanted a day off. Well, what would happen was the produce manager would go to the store manager and say, "You can't give him that day off. There's no one else to cover for him." Well, I would say, "Well, what about Steve? What about this guy? What about that guy?" And the excuse was, "Well, they can't handle it as good." And so I came to the conclusion that by doing a good job, and by standing out in the crowd, by being a leader, by being one who does a good job, that sort of thing, being responsible, it's almost like you get the short end of the stick. And so I was looking at it in the wrong way. What I should have looked at in it as a positive thing, that no, they looked to me to be someone that had great potential. And of course, this did pay off. Eventually, I got a lot of promotions within the company. And so just be aware of that could happen. But you're going to have to take, a lot of the times, you're going to have to take the blame for someone else, or you're going to have to take the blame for the whole group. All right, let's go ahead and move to our second example. Now, this is found in John 18. And to set the stage, this is where they were now in the garden right before the soldiers came with Judas and the crowds, and they were going to arrest Jesus. And John has some more information that the other Gospels don't have. And that's when Jesus was being arrested. They says they're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said, "I'm he," right? And they all fell back to the ground. That should have clued them in on something. Well, anyway, after they get up, they said, "Whom do you seek?" He says it again to him. This is where we'll pick it up in verses 8 and 9. And they said, "We're seeking Jesus of Nazareth." They said this a second time. Well, Jesus said, "I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which of he spoke, of those to whom you gave me, I've lost none." All right, so here we have Jesus sticking up for the whole group. And the idea that at the last statement there where it says, "Of those you gave me, I've lost none," that comes from John 17:12, when he was praying the prayer to the Father. And that's where that comes from. That's what he was referring to. But Jesus was willing to sacrifice for the group. In other words, he was going to be arrested, and he knew what lied ahead of him. But he didn't want his followers to get in any trouble if it could be avoided. So he was protecting them by saying, "Look, I'm the guy you're looking for, and if you found me, then let these guys go. Don't worry about them." Well, that's the attitude we may have to take. Well, we should take the attitude. What we may have to come to some days, we may have to sacrifice our well-being, maybe even our life. Now, there was a time back in early on in street ministry in my hometown, Everett, Washington. This was before I did any public preaching for the most part, but I did a lot of street ministry, a lot of praying with people, a lot of going just through the highways and byways, dealing with homeless, dealing with the drug addicted, evangelizing, one-on-one conversations, handing out tracts, Bibles, you know, name it. We got involved in it all. And I remember there was a time when we were in an alley, and there was a time when the authorities were, I don't know, this guy was it was a police officer. He had a attitude, I don't know. He sort of scooped us. He was going to scoop us all up with the homeless people. He didn't have any regard. He just wanted the people to disperse and whatnot. Well, anyway, long story short, and I don't say this to brag or anything, but I was sort of the leader of the group. So I went ahead and stepped forward and said, look, you know, if there's going to be any trouble, I'm the one responsible here. If you're going to arrest somebody, or if you're going to, you know, have any problems, let these guys go and deal with me. So we should be willing to do that. Now, two reasons. One reason is, as a leader, we should have that attitude. If there's going to be one representation of the group to go to jail, it should be you as a leader. Now, sometimes it isn't always your call. You know, one time I wanted to speak to they wanted to speak to the person in charge, and I wasn't the person in charge at this particular time. I was trying to run interference, if you will. And they said, no, we want to speak to the guy that's on the microphone. So they told me to step aside. Well, but in this particular case, I could have been arrested or whatever. But the main reason was we should have that servant's attitude where we're willing to lay our inconveniences down. I was willing to go to jail so these other guys wouldn't get in trouble. Now, the main reason is we should have the attitude. The second was, I had been in jail before. These guys had never been in jail. I figure I could handle it better than they could. Now, we are going to have to go by the grace and the strength that Christ gives us at the time. Because as I'm sitting here telling you this, I got to thinking, wonder if it was to go before a firing squad, would I have been as quick to say, yeah, I'll do it? You know, I can't say that I do that. I'd like to think I would. But I'm weak as anyone else, and I would need God's strength at that time to give a measure of grace to take on that role, and so will you, my friends. Okay, let's go ahead and look at the third example, and this is where I found this in the book of Acts. Paul is addressing the elders. It's in Acts chapter 20, and I just had gone through my Acts Bible study in chapter 20, and this is why it's fresh in my mind, but this caught my eye as I was going through 20, as he's giving this address to the elders right there. He, in his discourse, one of the things he says there in verse 34, he says, you yourselves know that these hands have provided for my necessities and for those who were with me. Okay, so a lot of times you are going to have to provide for the people that are with you. Or you don't, I guess you could say you don't have to, but this is something that's honorable. It's something that Paul did, something that, and at the time I believe he was talking about Silas and Timothy, those specific two guys that were with him the whole time. There were other guys that joined him, but I think that's who he was talking about mostly, because when he was in Ephesus there for like some 2 years. Well, anyway, maybe this could be paying their expenses. You remember Paul also paid for some other people to take a Nazirite vow. He paid for their expenses as well as his own. This would maybe just buy them lunch. I don't know. Okay. Now, when it comes to lending equipment, being a street preacher, I run into a lot of guys, they don't have their own equipment yet. For whatever reason, usually it's because of finances. I don't mind lending my equipment, or, you know, even buying some equipment for someone and giving it to them, supplying it for them just to enable them to be in the ministry. There, you know, without thinking, there's no question. to do that. But I wrote down here my bullet point to be discerning. And the reason is because a lot of times it would be easy for me to go, I'm in the position perhaps to finance a young and upcoming street preacher with some speakers and amplifiers and that, because you can, actually spend easily several $100s just buying basic stuff. I mean, you want to get good quality stuff, but not too good, because it could get thrashed around out there. Of course, that's another topic. But be discerning, because a lot of times the Lord might be wanting to test these guys to see how serious they are about the street preaching ministry. And when you buy your own stuff, then you're willing to spend your own money and sacrifice your own resources, then you are definitely serious about what you're doing. And of course we should balance that with a person is worthy of their wage, a workman's worthy of his wage. In other words, if it's not too much to ask that the larger group, the local church, perhaps supplies the street preachers, the evangelists with equipment. That's part of the partnership. But on the other hand, there are times. I remember one of the churches I used to attend up in Everett, Washington, my old hometown there. With their philosophy was, when they sent young people on these short-term mission trips to Mexico with the youth group, at least one trip a year they usually would take people on. At first, they would make the kids come up with their own money. They had to go earn it, or they didn't really like them to solicit it, but hey, if a relative wanted to give them some money, whatever. But the church wasn't going to provide any of their money. And at first I thought, well, gee, that's not right. It says one goes and another sends. I mean, the church should supply it. But then as it was explained to me, this principle that, that at the same time, if a lot of people will go if everything's paid for them, if it's an easy, soft way. But if they got to scratch and claw for to get there, then it shows they're really wanting to go and they're really serious. And I believe you're really called. If you're willing to take any resources and expend them on the mission that God wants you to do, then you're definitely serious about doing it. All right. Fourth and last example here. These are kind of several disciples. This is when the Lord and again Peter, James and John went on the Mount of Transfiguration. Well, apparently when they were up there, the rest of the disciples were down below. And when those guys came back down, they find themselves in the midst of this controversy where the Jews were there, the Jewish leaders and the disciples, and this man with his son who was demon-possessed. And basically he goes to Jesus and said, I asked your disciples to cast out the demon, but they couldn't. And Jesus goes, oh, you faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I have to be with you? Bring the boy to me. And he ends up casting out the demon and healing the boy. During that, there was a course of conversation there with the father. The father, he said, if you believe anything's possible. And the father said, the dad said to the guy, he said, yeah, I believe, help my unbelief. And there was that dialogue. And of course, this is found in several of the gospel accounts. But in Matthew 17, later, after the end of that, the disciples came and they asked Jesus, verse 19, Matthew 17, verse 19, it says, then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, why could we not cast it out? Jesus said, because of your unbelief. For assuredly I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. However, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting. Now, some of the other gospel accounts just say about the prayer and fasting, but I like this one because initially, when they were asked why couldn't they cast it out, it was because of their unbelief. Now, initially in the story, I put in my bullet points there, perhaps the responsibility of faith was on the father of the boy. Who was Jesus talking to when he said, oh, faithless and perverse generation? Was that directed to the whole situation, to all the parties involved? Was it particularly stressed to the young man and his boy, like that man didn't have enough faith? Or was he talking to the disciples? Because they'd seen him do all these miracles and he gave them permission to do them too. So, maybe he was talking more on them. Well, he definitely puts it on them when they ask him this, because he doesn't say it was because of the guy. When they said, why could we not cast it out? He doesn't say to them, oh, it was because of the Father. No, he says because of your unbelief. Now, as a leader, you're going to have faith for other people at different times. When you are, say, with a small group, I've taken a small group out in a ministry situation, and they're expecting you a lot of times as a leader to do the praying. If somebody says, I need prayer, they want you to initiate that prayer. So you're going to be called along a lot of times to pray for things like healing and stuff like that. Now, I think part of the leadership is to also train these other people, give them opportunity to pray as well. But they're going to be looking to you for your faith. Can you have faith to pray for this healing? See, that sort of thing. There's also going to be times when maybe it's a direction, or I know that a lot of times when we go out street preaching, a lot of the areas we go to, it takes a lot of faith, because there are areas where maybe we shouldn't go. Maybe they're too dangerous, or maybe for one reason or another, there's not a good reason we should go there. And as a leader, you're going to say, no, we're going to step out in faith and go. You got to call the shots. You're going to be put in a position to do that. So you're going to have faith for the group. And so you may have faith for another individual. Now, when it comes to praying for somebody, and this is my fourth bullet point there, a lot of the times the faith healers blame the ones that are in need when the miracle doesn't happen, right? It's easy to say, well, it was your faith, see? Well, a lot of times, let's be honest, it is. Jesus did point that out. A lot of times it was because of the person getting the prayer, receiving the healing or whatever, or not receiving it, whatever the case, it was because of their faith or lack thereof. But not every time. A lot of times it was on, and in this case, it was on the proof or the pudding was on the disciples. It was their faith, see? So I think that we need to have balance. That's all I'm saying in that. That kind of ties into that. So when you're out there praying, we have balance. But you are going to have faith for those that are weaker in faith. And so there you have it. So in review, there are times you're going to have to take blame for other people. There's going to be times when you have to sacrifice for other people as a leader. There's going to be times when you will have to provide or pay the way and be responsible for the whole group, or for at least someone else. And then finally, you will have to have a lot of times faith for someone else on their behalf. And so, my friends, thank you for joining us with this video. And make sure you look at the rest of the series and in the ones we have to come. I'm not sure how many I'll actually end up. Probably about 6 or so. And like I mentioned before, traditionally we have in the leadership series, you're going to get into, they think of mostly pastors and that sort of thing. So they could go to Timothy and 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus for that sort of thing. We may not include those because those are often so included, because I do want to make sure that this goes to leadership within smaller ministries. This isn't just for pastors of churches. A lot of you out there have a small ministry team that you're leading out there, maybe just your family. Maybe there's you and one or two other people. Sometimes you got to have a leader. You got to appoint a leader if there's none. It's best to have one leader when you go out on the streets, so there's no confusion and all being equal partners, but there's one person and that would take the lead. So anyway, well, with that, thank you very much for listening. And until we meet again, thank you and God bless.